Good day, all. This talk will examine early US superheroes, by which I mean superheroes that appeared before DC and Marvel arose. Like other early superheroes, they're all variations on the strong man and the wise man. And like other superheroes, they began as folk tales and then evolved into fiction. The very first US superhero was actually a folk hero, a strong man named Paul Bunyan. Like earlier folk heroes, he was probably based on a real person, and he was created first in oral history, with stories being told about him for several decades before they were written down, all the time being steadily exaggerated. Bunyan was a super lumberjack. He was a big, strong man who could chop down lots of trees, and he had a pet blue ox named Babe. He supposedly worked in the northern US states around the Great Lakes, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. He became a symbol of the loggers, logging camps, and lumber towns of that time and place, and he was a true rarity, a working class superhero. Bunyan was probably based on several loggers, but his legend seems to have started with a Quebecer, Fabien Fournier, aka Saginaw Joe, a real person who logged in Michigan from 1865 to 1875 when he was killed in a barroom brawl. Stories about Bunyan began to circulate in the 1870s, and they were collected and written down for the first time in 1906. Fournier was apparently about 6 feet tall, which was tall for that time. When the first Paul Bunyan stories were written, he was said to be about 7 feet tall, and then later on he became an impossibly tall giant, about 50 feet tall, able to chop down a forest with a single sweep of his axe. He could rearrange the landscape at will and created the Grand Canyon, among other landmarks. This puts Bunyan firmly in the tradition of the American tall tale, a story that's been so exaggerated that it is clearly impossible, but is still entertaining. Over the years, Bunyan's story became more of a children's story. But that's not how he started out. He started out as the embodiment of strong, manly loggers. He did not use his super strength to save people or catch criminals or kill the enemy. He just used it to do his job super well. He was the American working man's superhero. He cut down trees and he rearranged the landscape. He tamed the wilderness. He was a strong man because he worked in a time when muscles still mattered more than machinery, until they did not. Bunyan's story ends when a salesman with a new chainsaw challenges him to a tree-cutting contest and narrowly beats him. He realizes his time is over and he retires to Alaska. This symbolized two very real concerns for working class men at that time. First, that their masculinity was being undermined, as the manly muscles on which they prided themselves were made increasingly irrelevant by much stronger machines. And second, that those machines were going to take away many of their jobs, which indeed they have. Even though in later years Bunyan's story was co-opted by corporations and used heavily in advertising, he is still one of the few superheroes who expresses the values and interests of working class men. The early 20th century in the US also saw the transition from cartoons to comics. First, comic strips, then comic books began to appear. Since they had evolved from cartoons, these early comics were expected to be comic, as in funny. So early comic superheroes were also funny. The very first comic strip superhero was Hugo Hercules, who appeared in the Chicago Tribune from 1902 to 1903. Hugo was also the first funny strongman. He did prevent a couple of crimes, but he was not a crime fighter. He just wandered around doing random good deeds which were played for laughs. For example, he lifted up an elephant so that a lady could retrieve her handkerchief which the elephant had stepped on. The strip was not a great success and only ran for a few months, but it introduced the super strong man into US comics, and so was another step on the road from Hercules to Superman. Hugo also paved the way for a much more successful funny strongman, Popeye. Popeye first appeared in comic strips in 1929 and is still on the go to this day. Popeye is another working-class superhero, a 20th century Paul Bunyan. He is Popeye the Sailor Man, a regular seaman, not a captain or an admiral. He's just an ordinary guy who gains super strength when he eats his spinach. The early strips largely focused on Popeye preventing his archenemy Bluto from stealing his girl, Olive Oil, but later strips had Popeye foiling criminals and even preventing wars. As with most superheroes, his exploits grew over the years. Popeye appeals to both children and adults. Kids enjoy the action as Popeye uses his super strength. But for the adults, Popeye is actually a very cynical character who keeps up a running commentary of sarcastic comments that he mutters to himself as he goes along, particularly when he has to clean up somebody else's mess, which he often does. Popeye is a deliberate contradiction. At first sight, he appears to be a simple working man, uneducated, uncultured, rough and tumble, all muscle. But in an emergency, when the experts are baffled, Popeye comes up with some ingenious solution that saves the day. So, the strong man can also be a wise man, even if he doesn't look like it. Popeye represents the US working class telling their employers, "We are strong, but we also have brains," particularly when it comes to solving practical problems. After World War II, the need for a more educated workforce who had to use their brains because they were now working with high technology became generally accepted. So Popeye was a way for the American working class to say to the upper class, "We can do more than you think we can, especially if you feed us our spinach," meaning give us a decent living wage so we can eat and live properly, so that we can be healthy and strong and ready to work. This shows that even when the main goal of an artwork is humor, it always has a social context and social messages, if you know how to look for them. However, before Popeye appeared, an American author named Edgar Rice Burroughs invented not one but two new categories of superhero in 2 years. In 1911, he published the first story about a science fiction strongman, John Carter of Mars. And in 1912, he published the first story about a jungle strongman, Tarzan. Both of these appeared in the pulp magazines that were becoming popular at the time, so they were not at first comic book superheroes, although they have both appeared in comics in recent years. John Carter was a guy who went to sleep in a cave in the US and woke up in a cave on Mars. Burroughs never really tried to give a scientific explanation for how this happened. Clearly, he wasn't interested in how we got to Mars. He was only interested in what we might find when we got there. We know now that pretty much all there is on Mars is sand and rocks. But at the time, astronomers thought they saw canals on Mars, which later turned out to be just an optical illusion, but which made people in the early 20th century think that there might be a civilization on Mars. So, Carter met Martians and even got involved in a Martian war. Because Mars's gravity is less than a third that of Earth, Carter could jump for huge distances and was much stronger than the native Martians. Also, he had a military background. He was a former captain in the Confederate Army. So, Carter became the traditional strongman in a new setting, a great warrior who led his people to victory over the enemy, same as it ever was, except that he was on Mars and his people were green and had 4 arms. Carter became a strongman by traveling to another planet. This idea was, of course, taken up and greatly expanded on by Superman, who reverses Burroughs' formula. Carter was a human who gained super strength by going to an alien planet. Superman is an alien who gained super strength and other superpowers by coming to Earth. This means that Superman falls into the category of the science fiction strongman pioneered by Carter. Before Superman, there were other science fiction superheroes along the lines of Carter. Most famously, Buck Rogers, who debuted in 1928, and Flash Gordon, who debuted in 1934, both of whom first appeared in comic strips, then went on to other media. Buck Rogers was a World War I veteran who got trapped in a mine cave-in, exposed to radioactive gas, and woke up in the 25th century. Once there, he discovered that the US had been conquered by the Mongols. So he used his military knowledge to rally the Americans and retake the US. This is all a clear imitation of John Carter's story, except that Buck Rogers played the role of wise man more than strong man, the ancient superhero role of military strategist. Flash Gordon was a Yale graduate who had a professor friend who invented a rocket ship so that they could go to the planet Mongo, which was threatening to collide with Earth. They prevented the collision, but then stayed on the planet Mongo to fight the rule of the evil dictator Ming the Merciless, who they eventually overthrew, just like John Carter and Buck Rogers. The biggest difference between Flash Gordon and Carter and Rogers is that he didn't just go to sleep and wake up in a new world. He went to his new world in a spaceship. Flash Gordon was the first superhero with a spaceship. That was, in practice, his superpower. He both helped to introduce the American public to the idea of spaceflight and paved the way for later science fiction superheroes like Superman who came to Earth in a spaceship. John Carter became very popular, starring in a series of 11 books, which eventually formed the basis for 2 movies, released in 2009 and 2012. However, Burroughs' next creation was even more popular, Tarzan. Now, in one way, Tarzan is also a throwback to the traditional strongman because he's an English aristocrat. His real name is John Clayton, and his title is Viscount Greystoke. However, like Carter, he only became a superhero when he was suddenly and unexpectedly forced to leave his old world behind completely and go to live in a new world, the African jungle. As a small child, he and his parents were marooned on the African coast by mutineers. His parents soon died, and he was adopted and raised by the Mangani, a fictional species of great ape. In the books, Tarzan eventually went back to England to reclaim his aristocratic title and to marry Jane. But he quickly became disgusted with civilization, and they returned to the jungle. Although he formally retained his title, in practice he renounced his aristocratic heritage. He became Lord of the Jungle, not because he was an aristocrat, but because he was raised by the apes. Technically, Tarzan was what is termed a feral child or wild child. Ever since the 18th century, there have been occasional documented cases of authorities finding children who've been abandoned by their parents or, like Tarzan, had their parents die, and who were raised by packs of animals, including dogs, wolves, and apes, among others. In the real world, feral children reintroduced to human society tend to have difficulty learning to speak or interact with other people or live a normal life. Very often, their experiences have left them with a permanent mental handicap. In the world of fiction, however, an idealized wild child was first introduced by Rudyard Kipling, Mowgli, in The Jungle Book, published in 1893. Kipling was British, but grew up in India, which was then part of the British Empire. Kipling has said that Mowgli was based on local Indian folk tales of a jungle child. So, as with most early superheroes, his story began as an oral history, which was eventually written down by Kipling. Mowgli was very smart and could talk to the jungle animals, a young wise man. Burroughs has said that he originally envisioned Tarzan basically as a grown-up Mowgli. Tarzan is best known as a strong man, but in the books he's also a wise man. He's very intelligent and can learn languages very quickly, including animal languages. The whole "me Tarzan, you Jane" pidgin English cliché came in the movies much later. In the original books, Tarzan learned to speak perfect English right away, and it was his brains as well as his muscles that always allowed him to defeat the bad guys and save the day. Tarzan first appeared in the pulp magazines and has since appeared in every possible medium: books, comics, radio, TV, movies, video games, everything. Burroughs' characters were so popular, partly because he managed to have his cake and eat it. That is to say, he created heroes who are both traditional and modern. They were traditional heroes who were forced to leave tradition behind. Carter was an old-fashioned Southern gentleman who left the Confederacy behind because it was dead. And Tarzan was an English aristocrat who left the aristocracy behind because it was dying. Tarzan became so popular that satirical imitations of him began to appear, creating another superhero subtype, the funny jungle strongman. The most famous examples of this are the caveman, Alley-Oop, who appears in a cartoon strip which began in 1932 and is still running, and George of the Jungle, who first appeared in an animated TV series in 1967, then in a live-action movie with Brendan Fraser in 1997, then in another animated TV series in 2007. George would swing through the jungle on vines like Tarzan, but he was not as smart or as skilled as Tarzan, which is why his theme song went, "George of the Jungle, watch out for that tree." For Burroughs' audience, there was just one problem with his heroes. They lived very far away, on Mars and in Africa. An American audience wanted someone who performed heroic deeds in America. That someone was Z for Zorro. Zorro first appeared in 1919. He was a Californian nobleman who lived in Los Angeles while it was under Mexican rule from 1821 to 1846. He defended the common people against corrupt and tyrannical Mexican government officials who he enjoyed making fools of. By day, he played an effete, foppish dandy, but by night, he put on his all-black costume, complete with mask, cape, and sword, and used his superior skills in swordsmanship and horsemanship to teach the Mexicans a lesson. He was supposedly based on several Mexican social bandits of that time, in particular Joaquin Murrieta, aka the Mexican Robin Hood. However, in literary terms, he was actually more of an American version of the Scarlet Pimpernel, an English-speaking aristocrat who pretended to be a foolish dandy, but who actually had a secret identity that allowed him to regularly outsmart a foreign government, either French or Mexican. Zorro was the first US mystery man, and he introduced the US to the idea of a superhero with a mask and a secret identity. Zorro first appeared in the pulp magazines, but has since appeared in books, movies, TV series, and other media. Zorro led on to another similar American hero, the Lone Ranger. Like Zorro, the Lone Ranger was partly inspired by a real person, Texas Ranger Captain John Hughes, and partly by a fictional character, Zorro. As we've seen all along, reality and fiction constantly blur in the creation of superheroes. The Lone Ranger first appeared in 1933 on a radio show in Detroit and went on to appear in books, comics, TV, movies, and so on. Like Zorro, the Lone Ranger wore a mask, had a secret identity, fought for justice, and was an expert horseman. One difference was that Zorro fought in the first half of the 19th century, so he used a sword, while the Lone Ranger fought in the latter half of the 19th century, so he used a gun. Indeed, the Lone Ranger's main superpower was that he was superhumanly accurate with a gun. He never killed the bad guys. Instead, he just shot the guns out of their hands, which in reality is virtually impossible. Another difference between the two is that Zorro, like the Scarlet Pimpernel, fought against a foreign government, but the Lone Ranger fought American criminals, bringing us another step closer to our current crime-fighting superheroes. The Lone Ranger has an origin story that makes him the first masked avenger. The Scarlet Pimpernel and Zorro fought for political reasons, but for the Lone Ranger, it was personal. He was called the Lone Ranger because he was originally Ranger John Reed, the sole survivor of a group of 6 Texas Rangers who were ambushed by the Cavendish gang. He then made it his mission to see that the gang was tracked down and brought to justice. Once he did, he just went right on catching other criminals. But his original motivation was revenge. This plot device was adopted for a number of later superheroes, most famously Batman and Spider-Man. Another difference is that the Lone Ranger is not an aristocrat, because by the late 19th century, the aristocracy were pretty much gone from the US. Instead, he started out as an officer of the law, a Texas Ranger, so that when he became the Lone Ranger, he retained legitimacy in the eyes of the audience, even though in practice he'd become a masked vigilante operating outside the law. And while he was not an aristocrat, he was rich, because he happened to own a silver mine, which gave him the freedom and resources to be the Lone Ranger. This was a convenient plot device, but it also meant that he was still an upper-class superhero. The rich aristocratic superhero had been replaced by the rich capitalist superhero. This has been copied most famously by Batman and Iron Man, both billionaire industrialist superheroes. It is an image of upper-class men risking their lives fighting crime in order to help the common people, something that, of course, never happens in the real world. The final main difference between the two is that the Lone Ranger, despite his name, is not alone. He has a sidekick, Tonto. The Lone Ranger and Tonto were the first modern superhero-super sidekick combination, and were in practice the model for Batman and Robin. Tonto was originally introduced simply so that the Lone Ranger would have someone to talk to. On a radio show, you could not have the Lone Ranger just riding around by himself in silence. However, Tonto was also an attempt to move beyond the old Western stereotype that the only good Injun is a dead Injun. Tonto was the first indigenous hero in mainstream US culture. At first, he spoke pidgin English, but when real-life indigenous people pointed out that this was offensive, he quickly learned proper English. Moreover, Tonto knew the secrets of old Indian lore, the secrets of nature, so he could be the wise man to the Lone Ranger's strong man, an updated form of Arthur and Merlin. In the TV series, Tonto was played by Canadian Jay Silverheels, a Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario. In the US, Tonto is probably still the most famous Indigenous hero, and I would argue that his creation helped to improve the way that white Americans thought about their native peoples. Zorro first introduced the American public to the masked mystery man. By the time the Lone Ranger appeared in 1933, the 1930s had already become established in American popular culture as the decade of the mystery man. 1930 saw the debut of The Shadow, and he was followed by many more. The best known ones were, in order, Doc Savage, the Spider, Mandrake the Magician, the Phantom, the Green Hornet, and it all peaked with the first publication of Batman in 1939. This is the first but not the last time that we shall see such a creative spurt in a particular category of superhero. Except for Batman, I'm not going to go through each of these mystery men individually. They're all very similar. They all fight crime. They all, except for Doc Savage, wear a mask and have a secret identity. None of them have any real superpowers except for superior fighting ability, and in some cases the ability to cloud men's minds with some sort of super hypnosis. But they do all in different ways have access to some sort of secret knowledge, which is what fits them all into the wise man category. For example, the Shadow's tagline was, "What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows." So, this establishes up front that the Shadow knows things that most people do not. He's a man of knowledge, a wise man. The mystery men represented US popular culture building up to the creation of Batman and Superman, who I shall examine in my next talk. That concludes what I have to say on early US superheroes. A transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.